Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing in a museum hall. Behind thick glass, illuminated by a single beam of light, rests a sword. Not just any sword. A Damascus blade forged over 800 years ago, somewhere between the Silk Roads of Syria and the crucible fires of India. The metal surface ripples like frozen water. Dark waves cascade across the steel as if the blade itself were carved from liquid shadow and moonlight. This is not decoration. This is not engraving. These patterns emerged from within the metal itself, born in fire, shaped by secrets we no longer possess. Pick up that blade, if you could, and you would feel something extraordinary. Despite centuries of silence, the edge remains sharp enough to slice through silk dropped upon it. The steel bends without breaking. It cuts through iron and stone, yet springs back to perfect form. Warriors of the Crusades spoke of these blades in whispered terror. European swords shattered against them. Knights fell before weapons that seemed forged not by human hands, but by something beyond comprehension. And here is the mystery that has haunted metallurgists, historians and scientists for over 2 centuries. We cannot make them anymore. The formula is lost. The technique vanished. Every modern attempt to recreate true Damascus steel has failed. We have split atoms, mapped the human genome, and sent machines to the edge of our solar system. Yet we cannot reproduce a sword made by blacksmiths who worked by firelight and intuition. This is not just a story about metal. This is a story about human genius reaching heights we can no longer touch. About knowledge so profound it vanished like smoke, leaving only legend and impossible artifacts behind. Tonight, you will travel back through time, to the foundries of medieval Damascus, to the crucible workshops of ancient India, to the moment when human hands discovered something miraculous in fire and ore, and then lost it forever. This is the lost art of Damascus steel, and this is the question that echoes across centuries. What else have we forgotten? Our story begins not in Damascus, but further east, in the subcontinent of India, perhaps as early as 300 BCE, though the exact moment is lost to time. Imagine ancient workshops in the regions of Hyderabad, in southern India, the air thick with heat and ash. Blacksmiths working with a material they called Wootz, crucible steel, created through a process that took days of continuous firing, precise temperature control, and ingredients whose ratios were guarded more carefully than gold. These smiths discovered something extraordinary. By combining specific iron ores with precise amounts of carbon, by heating the mixture in sealed clay crucibles for extended periods, by cooling the metal in exactly the right way. They could create steel unlike anything the world had ever seen. The carbon didn't just mix with the iron. It formed microscopic structures within the metal, carbide bands that created internal patterns invisible to the naked eye until the blade was forged and etched. The result was steel that possessed contradictory properties, incredibly hard at the edge, yet flexible in the spine, sharp enough to cut through bone, yet resilient enough to never shatter. This was Wootz steel, the foundation of what would become legend. But how did this Indian metallurgical miracle become known as Damascus steel? That journey takes us along the ancient Silk Road, that network of trade routes connecting east and west, where not just silk and spices travelled, but knowledge, techniques, and secrets. Wootz steel ingots, small cakes of the precious metal, were traded westward. They travelled through Persia, through the Middle East, until they reached the forges of Damascus, Syria. And there, in that legendary city, master swordsmiths took this remarkable raw material and transformed it into weapons of myth. The bladesmiths of Damascus became renowned throughout the medieval world. They understood how to forge Wootz steel without destroying its miraculous properties. They knew the temperatures, the hammer techniques, the forging methods that would bring out those distinctive watery patterns while preserving the steel's legendary performance. European Crusaders who faced these blades in battle returned home with stories that seemed like fantasy. Swords that could cut through a European broadsword. Blades that could slice a falling silk scarf in mid-air. Steel that held an edge indefinitely and never rusted or tarnished. Richard the Lionheart himself supposedly tested his European sword against Saladin's Damascus blade. Richard's sword cut through an iron mace with brute force. Saladin's blade cut through a silk veil floating in the air. Two philosophies of warfare, two approaches to metallurgy, but only one seemed to possess magic. What made Damascus steel different wasn't just the carbon content. Modern steel can match that. It was the microscopic structure, the way the metal was organized at the molecular level. Inside true Damascus steel, researchers have discovered something remarkable. Carbon nanotubes. Yes, nanotechnology, thousands of years before we had the instruments to see it or the science to understand it. The Wootz process created structures within the steel measuring mere nanometers in width. These microscopic tubes and wires of cementite, iron carbide, form networks throughout the blade. They gave the steel properties that seemed impossible, the ability to hold an incredibly sharp edge while remaining flexible, resistance to shattering, and that distinctive watered silk pattern that emerged when the blade was etched with acid. Ancient smiths didn't know about nanotubes or carbide structures. They worked by intuition, by tradition, by trial and error, passed down through generations. They knew that certain ores from specific mines, combined in particular ways, fired at precise temperatures, would produce this miraculous material. They discovered nanotechnology by accident and by genius. Think about that for a moment. These craftsmen, working with nothing but fire, hammer, and inherited wisdom, created a material that modern metallurgists, with all our electron microscopes and computer modelling, struggled for centuries to understand. Between the 11th and 17th centuries, Damascus blades represented the pinnacle of weapons technology. They were prized across 3 continents. Warriors, nobles, and collectors would pay fortunes for a genuine Damascus sword. The blades served not just as weapons, but as diplomatic gifts, symbols of power, and works of art. Each sword was unique, no 2 patterns identical. The watered silk effect, called damascening, appeared different on every blade, like fingerprints in steel. Masters signed their work with pride. Names like Ibn al-Kuf and al-Kindi became legendary. These smiths understood something profound, that human craft could transcend mere function and become transformation, that steel could be elevated to art, that weapons could embody beauty and terror in equal measure. But this golden age was built on a foundation most didn't understand. The Damascus smiths were not creating the steel itself. They were forging Wootz ingots imported from India. The true secret, the original miracle, resided in those Indian crucible workshops. And secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, are fragile things. As the 18th century approached, something began to change. The supply of Wootz ingots started to diminish. The knowledge in India began to fade. Trade routes shifted. Political powers transformed. And slowly, quietly, like a candle flame guttering in the wind, the secret began to die. By the mid-18th century, the production of true Wootz steel had ceased in India. By the early 19th century, the last Damascus blades were being forged from remaining stockpiles of old ingots. And then, nothing. The forges went cold. The techniques fell silent. A craft that had endured for over 2,000 years vanished within a single generation. How does this happen? How does profound knowledge simply disappear? The answer is more complex and more tragic than you might imagine. First, understand that these techniques were never written down in detail. This was oral tradition, craft knowledge passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. The ratios of ingredients, the temperatures, the timing, these existed in the hands and minds of smiths, not in manuscripts. In India, the Wootz steel workshops depended on specific iron ores from particular mines. As the British Empire expanded its control over India, industrial mining operations disrupted traditional sources. The small-scale crucible steel production couldn't compete with industrial European steel flooding the markets. Economic pressures destroyed what military conquest could not. Additionally, the exact mineral composition of the ore mattered immensely. Trace elements like vanadium and molybdenum in the raw iron were crucial to forming the proper carbide structures. When mines were exhausted or abandoned, finding equivalent ore proved impossible. In Damascus, the situation was equally dire. Without Wootz ingots to forge, the smiths could not practice their art. The specific forging techniques developed over centuries to work with Wootz steel became irrelevant when working with other types of steel. Masters aged and died. Apprentices moved to other trades. The unbroken chain of knowledge, passed hand to hand for 1,000 years, finally broke. But there was something else, something more subtle and more devastating. The Industrial Revolution changed how humanity thought about craft and production. Mass manufacturing replaced individual artisanship. Factories produced cheap steel in quantities that individual smiths could never match. Efficiency and standardization became paramount. The slow, painstaking process of creating Wootz steel in crucibles, a process that took days and produced only small amounts, seemed archaic, inefficient, a relic of a primitive past. Why spend days creating a single sword when you could stamp out 100 in an hour? The economic logic was unassailable, the cultural cost was incalculable. As the 19th century progressed, scholars and metallurgists began to realize what had been lost. Museums held Damascus blades whose properties they could observe, but not explain. The watered silk patterns defied understanding. The steel's performance characteristics seemed impossible, given the technology available to medieval smiths. Theories multiplied. Some suggested the patterns were purely decorative, created through etching or inlay. Others proposed that the blades had been forge-welded from different types of steel. Still others whispered about secret quenching methods or mysterious additives to the metal. Russian metallurgist Pavel Anosov, working in the 1830s and 40s, made the first serious scientific attempt to recreate Wootz steel. He studied ancient texts, examined existing blades, conducted hundreds of experiments with different ores and techniques. Anosov came tantalizingly close. He produced steel with some of the characteristic patterns and good cutting properties. But he knew, every honest scientist knew, that he had not truly recreated the original. Something was missing. Some crucial element remained hidden. Anosov's work, groundbreaking as it was, ultimately failed to revive the art. His techniques were complex and difficult to reproduce. After his death, even his methods were lost, becoming just another layer in the archaeological sediment of forgotten knowledge. As the 20th century arrived, new scientific instruments offered new approaches to the mystery. Metallurgists could now examine Damascus blades at high magnification, could analyze their chemical composition, could see structures invisible to previous generations. What they found was shocking. The watered silk patterns weren't surface decoration. They were cross-sections of internal carbide structures. Long bands of cementite, mere micrometers wide, ran through the steel. These bands formed when the carbon-rich steel was forged and worked, creating the visible patterns when acid etching revealed the varying crystalline structures. But how? How did medieval smiths create such precise microscopic structures without any understanding of metallurgical science? The answer remained elusive. Modern steel manufacturers could make high-carbon steel. They could create steel with excellent properties. But they could not replicate the specific carbide banding and nanoscale structures of true Damascus steel. Attempts continued throughout the century. bladesmiths created pattern-welded steel by forge welding layers of different types of steel together, a technique that created similar visual patterns but entirely different internal structures. These blades were beautiful, but they were not Damascus steel. They were replicas of the appearance without the underlying miracle. J.D. Verhoeven and A.H. Pendray, working in the 1990s, made significant breakthroughs. They discovered the importance of trace elements, particularly vanadium, in forming the carbide bands. They found that specific impurities in ancient Indian ore were crucial to the process, not contaminants to be removed, but essential ingredients. They produced steel with authentic Damascus patterns and legitimate carbide structures. For a moment, it seemed the mystery might be solved, but even Verhoeven acknowledged the limitations. They had recreated some aspects of Wootz steel through scientific understanding and modern equipment, but could they recreate it using only the techniques available to ancient smiths? Could they produce it consistently? Could they truly claim to have recovered the lost art? The honest answer was no. They had touched the shadow of the original knowledge, but not grasped it fully. Pause here for a moment. Consider what this loss represents. This is not like misplacing a recipe or forgetting how to perform a magic trick. This is the complete obliteration of profound technical knowledge accumulated over millennia. Knowledge that represented the pinnacle of human achievement in its domain. Knowledge that billions of dollars and decades of modern scientific research have struggled to fully recover. The smiths who created Wootz steel understood something about the relationship between metal, heat, time, and material composition that we are only beginning to grasp with electron microscopes and computer simulations. They knew how to see the invisible, to work with processes at scales smaller than the eye could perceive, to create structures we now call nanotechnology using only fire and intuition. And we let it die, not through war or conquest or catastrophe, but through economic pressure, cultural change, and simple neglect. Because it seemed inefficient. Because it didn't fit the new industrial paradigm. Because no one thought to preserve it until it was too late. How many other miracles have we lost this way? How many other peaks of human achievement have been buried under the march of progress? The Damascus steel mystery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. That history is not a straight line of progress. That ancient peoples sometimes possessed knowledge and capabilities we have since lost. That our ancestors were not primitive versions of ourselves, but fully human, fully intelligent, solving problems with creativity and genius that can still astonish us. The lost art of Damascus steel is a mirror, and in it we see our own assumption of superiority reflected back as hubris. In 2006, a team of researchers led by Peter Porfler at the Technical University of Dresden published findings that sent shockwaves through the materials science community. Using high-resolution transmission electron microscopy, they had examined a 17th century Damascus blade and discovered something extraordinary: carbon nanotubes and nanowires within the steel structure. Carbon nanotubes, cylindrical molecules of carbon just a few nanometers in diameter, are at the cutting edge of modern materials science. They possess remarkable properties. Stronger than steel, yet incredibly light. Excellent conductors of heat and electricity, with applications in everything from electronics to medicine. These structures were first officially identified by modern science in 1991. They are created in modern laboratories using techniques like chemical vapor deposition, requiring precise temperature control and specialized equipment. And yet, there they were, in a sword forged 300 years before we discovered them, created not in a high-tech laboratory, but in a medieval forge. The ancient smiths didn't know they were creating nanotubes. They knew that certain techniques with certain materials produce superior steel. The carbon nanotubes and nanowires formed as byproducts of the crucible process. The long, slow heating in the presence of specific impurities allowed carbon atoms to organize into these remarkable structures. This discovery confirmed what many had suspected. Damascus steel wasn't just good by ancient standards. It represented a genuine achievement in materials science, one that we're only now beginning to fully understand. But it also revealed something else. It showed that the ancient smiths' empirical knowledge, gained through centuries of trial and error, had led them to a process that modern science, with all its theory and instruments, had not anticipated. They achieved through craft what we struggle to achieve through science. Today's attempts to recreate Damascus steel come from multiple directions. Materials scientists approach it from the perspective of nanotechnology and metallurgy. Historical researchers study ancient texts and archaeological evidence. Experimental archaeologists try to recreate the original techniques using period-appropriate tools and methods. Some have had remarkable success. Bladesmith Rick Furrer, working with historian John Verhoeven, produced steel with authentic carbide banding and watered patterns. They identified the crucial role of vanadium and other trace elements. They demonstrated that the original process could be approximated, but approximated is the key word. Every recreation involves some modern innovation, some technique or understanding not available to the original smiths. We're solving the puzzle with pieces they didn't have access to. Consider this. We can explain Damascus steel in terms of crystal structures, phase diagrams, and carbide formation. We can visualize it at the atomic level. We understand the chemistry and physics underlying its properties. But can we reproduce the art exactly as it was practiced, without modern instruments, modern knowledge, modern materials science? Can we replicate not just the product, but the process? The answer remains ambiguous. We have recreated Damascus-like steel. We have not recreated the art of Damascus steel. There are aspects of the original craft that may be permanently lost. Not just the technical knowledge, but the cultural context, the aesthetic understanding, the craftsman's intuition developed over a lifetime of practice. When a master smith examined Wootz steel, they could read its qualities by eye and touch. They knew how it would behave under the hammer, how it would respond to heat, what patterns would emerge. This was not scientific knowledge, but embodied knowledge, understanding that lived in the hands and eyes, built through decades of direct experience. That cannot be recovered from books or microscopes. It must be learned by doing, passed from teacher to student, refined over generations. We have the artifacts. We can analyze them, measure them, understand their structure. But we don't have the masters who created them. We don't have the unbroken tradition of practice. And without that, we have information, but not wisdom. We have data, but not art. There's a deeper revelation here, one that goes beyond metallurgy. The lost art of Damascus steel teaches us about the nature of knowledge itself. We live in an age that privileges explicit, codified, written knowledge. Information that can be stored in books and databases, transmitted through text and video. But much of human knowledge isn't like that. It's tacit, embodied, experiential. It exists in the relationship between human and material, in the practiced judgment that can't be reduced to rules. When we lose the practitioners of an art, we lose not just their techniques, but their understanding, the way they saw the world, the questions they asked, the possibilities they perceived. Despite all our modern understanding, mysteries still surround Damascus steel. We still don't know exactly which mines produced the ore with the perfect trace element composition. We don't fully understand all the variations in the Wootz process across different regions and periods. We can't explain why some Damascus blades show certain pattern types while others show different configurations. And there are tantalizing hints that the knowledge was even more sophisticated than we realize. Some historical accounts describe Damascus blades that could cut through gun barrels, blades that never needed sharpening, steel that was somehow alive in the hands of the warrior. Are these exaggerations, legends that grew in the retelling, or glimpses of capabilities that we haven't yet rediscovered? We may never know for certain. The primary sources are sparse and often cryptic. The artifacts give us the end result, but not the full process. The chain of transmission was broken before anyone thought to document it completely. And so, Damascus steel remains, even now, partially shrouded in mystery. We can see the mountain, we can begin to map its slopes, but the summit remains hidden in clouds. Yet the story doesn't end in loss and mystery. Damascus steel has become a symbol, a touchstone for human aspiration and achievement. Modern bladesmiths continue to work with pattern-welded steel, creating beautiful blades that honour the aesthetic of Damascus, even if they don't fully replicate its structure. The patterns have inspired artists and designers. The legend continues to capture imaginations. In materials science laboratories, researchers studying carbon nanotubes and advanced materials sometimes look back to Damascus steel for inspiration. Here was a material that combined seemingly contradictory properties through careful manipulation of nanoscale structures, exactly what modern materials science aspires to do. The ancient smiths pointed the way. They showed what was possible, even if we're still learning how they achieved it. And perhaps most importantly, Damascus steel stands as a reminder that knowledge is fragile, that expertise can be lost, that we must actively preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of our species, or risk losing marvels we may never recover. Every museum that holds Damascus blades, every research paper analysing their structure, every bladesmith attempting to recreate them, these are acts of remembrance, ways of honouring the genius of those ancient craftsmen who discovered something miraculous and held it in trust for 1,000 years before it slipped through our fingers. So where does this leave us? At the end of our journey through fire and steel, through loss and rediscovery, what have we learned? Damascus steel is more than a metallurgical curiosity. It's a parable about human knowledge and human hubris, about the heights we can reach and how easily we can fall, about the difference between data and wisdom, between replication and understanding. Those ancient smiths, working in firelight with tools we'd consider primitive, achieved something we still cannot fully replicate. Not because they were magicians or aliens or anything supernatural, but because they were human, remarkably, brilliantly human. They paid attention. They experimented. They refined their craft over generations. They developed an intimate understanding of their materials that we, for all our science, are still trying to match. They created beauty and function unified in steel. Weapons that were art, tools that were poetry. And then we let it vanish. But that's not quite the end of the story, because the Damascus blades survived. They rest in museums and private collections, silent witnesses to forgotten genius. And because of those artifacts, because smiths and scholars refused to let the mystery die, we have reclaimed some of what was lost. Not all of it, maybe never all of it, but enough to remember, enough to inspire, enough to humble us. Look again at that rippling pattern on Damascus steel, those waves frozen in metal. What do you see? You might see the microscopic carbide bands revealed by acid etching. You might see the aesthetic vision of craftsmen who shape beauty from iron and carbon. You might see the countless hours of experimentation and refinement that led to this result. But look deeper. Look at what the pattern really represents. It's a record of human persistence, of knowledge accumulated grain by grain across centuries, of masters teaching apprentices, of failed experiments and successful innovations, of problems solved and techniques perfected. Each wave in that pattern is a generation of smiths. Each ripple is a discovery, an insight, a moment of understanding. And the fact that the pattern exists at all, that these blades survived while the knowledge that created them did not, is both tragedy and hope. Tragedy, because it represents loss, knowledge that vanished, expertise that died, capabilities we must now struggle to reclaim. But hope, because it proves what humans can achieve. It demonstrates that our ancestors possessed genius equal to our own. It reminds us that knowledge once lost can be partially recovered, that mysteries can be penetrated, that the impossible can become possible again. We live in an age drowning in information, but starving for wisdom. We can access more facts in seconds than our ancestors encountered in lifetimes. But how much understanding do we have? How much embodied knowledge? How much craft? Damascus steel calls us to value not just what can be quantified and measured, but what must be practiced and felt. To respect the tacit knowledge that lives in human hands and eyes and judgment. To preserve not just the products of expertise, but the expertise itself. Because here's the truth that echoes through the centuries. We are not the summit of human achievement. We are one moment in a long journey. Ancient people solved problems we're still wrestling with, created materials we struggle to replicate, achieved understanding we're only beginning to recover. And if we're not careful, if we don't actively work to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, we too will lose marvels that future peoples will struggle to recreate. What are the Damascus steels of our age? What knowledge are we failing to preserve because we assume it's outdated, inefficient, or obsolete? What wisdom is dying with elders we don't bother to question? What crafts are vanishing because they don't scale to industrial production? These are not rhetorical questions, they are urgent ones. Because loss is not a historical problem, it's a present danger. Picture this. A young blacksmith somewhere in the world holds a blade of Damascus steel, perhaps in a museum, perhaps in a private collection. They look at the watered pattern rippling across the surface. They wonder, how did the ancients do this? What did they know? What secrets are hidden in this metal? And then they go to their forge. They light the fire. They take up hammer and tongs. They begin to experiment, to try, to fail, to try again. Maybe they will rediscover what was lost. Maybe they will create something new. Maybe they will carry forward the tradition into whatever future awaits us. That is the true legacy of Damascus steel. Not the blades themselves, beautiful as they are. Not even the knowledge that created them, crucial as that is. The legacy is the inspiration, the call to craft, the reminder that human hands and minds working together across generations can create miracles. The fire still burns. The metal still waits. The pattern is still there, hidden in the right combination of ore and heat and time, waiting to be discovered again. Damascus steel is not just history. It's a challenge, a question posed to every generation. What will you create that's worthy of remembrance? What knowledge will you preserve for those who come after? What mysteries will you solve, and what mysteries will you leave as gifts for the future? The ancient smiths answered that challenge with steel that still cuts, still amazes, still defies us after 1,000 years. Now it's our turn. The forge awaits. The pattern in the metal is the pattern of human knowledge, accumulated slowly, transmitted carefully, lost tragically, and recovered hopefully. Damascus steel is not just a lost art. It's a lesson written in carbide and fire, a lesson we must learn again and again, as long as we wish to call ourselves inheritors of those who came before, and ancestors of those yet to come.